vice provost at Cornell University, which means I'm responsible for financial aid and also admissions and registration. And I have a background in financial aid that I hope will be helpful to you. I think the way we're going to structure this is I'm going to walk us through sort of basics, financial aid 101. And there's still quite a bit of detail in there. You don't have to memorize it. I'm sure if you want this information later, you can come get it from me or from other places at Cornell or from AIISP. We'll make sure that we give you guidance as you go through the financial aid process ahead. But I'll get started, and mostly I just want to try to set it up so that you feel assured that financial aid can be, and for many of you will be, part of your college experience, and that's okay. That's actually the best way that people go to college. I'm not sure how many here might be first generation college. That was my situation going to college many years ago. And I didn't have a lot of help and a lot of guidance, but ultimately I got a lot of financial aid, and that's part of what made it possible for me to go. Wouldn't have done it otherwise. And then the second half I'll take any questions, and you may have questions that are much more detailed and sophisticated than what I put in the presentation, and that's fine. I'll do my best to answer those too. And I'm going to speak a little bit from the Cornell perspective because that's where I work now. I've always worked at universities sort of like Cornell, but there are many different kind of universities and colleges, and there are some differences in how they approach financial aid. I'll try to touch on that a little bit, and I, again, be happy to answer questions about specifics related to that. So I think am I gonna share my screen, Wava? Is that what happens next?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess okay, there I go. I'm doing that. All right. Okay. I'm gonna leap right into this, and I apologize. I can't entirely look at my presentation and present it and look at your face at the same time. So if I say something that I'm going too fast or is really confusing, you could write down a question in the chat, or you could save that question for after. And I'll go a little quickly here because I know some of you probably know some of this stuff already, and I don't want to bore you. All right, so paying college costs, that's really what we're talking about when we talk about financial aid. I'm going to move to the actual slideshow from the beginning now. Okay. So first, I just want to make sure you understand the big picture from a perspective like mine or the universities about how financial aid works. And I'll keep this really simple. Financial aid can often feel very complicated, but the basic gist of it is pretty similar. First, it costs money to go to college, or it costs money for a college to do all the things that you want to do. Wava spoke about how important it is for students like you, ambitious, talented students, to go to college, to complete degree programs, to move forward in society with all of the advantages that brings. But none of that is free. Even when it's offered at relatively lower costs from one college to another, it all costs something. So the things on the top, the 6 bullet points there on the top, are all things that it's assumed that all students need in order to go to college. They need a room to sleep in. Usually it's where they do some of their studying. It's where they relax. There are lots of other things they do out and around the campus, but the room is pretty critical. And then there's something called board, and these two are usually lumped together as room and board. The board just means food. It just means whether you are buying food as you go or whether you have what's called a meal plan that serves you sometimes all you can eat, breakfast, lunch, and dinner on some days. You will have a room and board charge. That's assumed for everybody going to college. Transportation, sometimes this is just what do you have to take, car, plane, bus, train, to get to the college and then stay there and live there. Sometimes it's you're living at home, but you're going back and forth to the college campus every day or many days a week. So that's included. Miscellaneous, this is sort of the other expenses that you have. And you have these costs now in many cases. It could be the cost of your phone every month, or the cost of what it takes to go out back in the days pre-COVID when we used to go out sometimes and spend money on a movie or eating out. Those things are accounted for in college costs. Books and supplies, of course, college, you end up doing a lot of reading. You need supplies like notebooks and pens and pencils. Maybe, and this is one of the ones that's sort of a gray area, and there are gray areas, maybe you need a laptop or some other kind of technology support to go to college and to be successful. Sometimes that's considered a fundamental part, a basic part of your college costs, and sometimes it's not. So that's something you have to look at each college one at a time, and sometimes ask your financial aid officer if there is any kind of plan for helping you make sure you've got a good laptop, or in some cases a desktop or another computer. And then the big one, and this is the real difference between college and everything else you do, college charges tuition. Some of you may be going to private schools, or you may have paid tuition for other kinds of activities. But basically, this is how college is run. This is what pays the bills. Mostly it pays salaries, your faculty, professors, the staff around you, all the support activities. They all have employees who draw a salary. There's costs for the buildings that make up a college campus. New and old buildings both need a lot of support. The technology, the computer structure that exists on every college campus costs money. Libraries, both the books they have and fees they get charged for accessing library databases from all over the world. And then your student activities. That might be a good example of something for which you pay fees, because there's more to do in college than just classes and libraries and studying. And sometimes some of those activities you want to do together cost money. I wanted to mention a few things that are not included, only because this comes up a lot in financial aid. And it's kind of important to understand, as you set out, that this is not something that's considered part of financial aid's responsibility. So you have to be somewhat careful in thinking about what you use financial aid to pay for and what you don't. There's no money provided in financial aid to help your family. Financial aid is provided to you as the college student. I'm going to show in the next slide or two how they do care a lot about whether your family has enough money. That is actually a really important part of financial aid. But they're not paying you a salary or giving you a scholarship so that you can turn around and help your little brother or your cousin with something their expense. So you might still be able to do that. You might figure out ways to do that, but that's not what financial aid is for. Financial aid also only covers your regular semester expenses. So typically in the United States, that's fall and spring, 2 semesters. Sometimes it's 3 quarters that make up the regular school year. So the expenses you have in summer are typically not covered by financial aid. And that's kind of important to understand as you go forward. It's not a year-round support. It's just for the fall and spring during school. And then even though I mentioned up above that there are supports that can pay for things like minimal phone service or other kinds of basics, the hygiene products you buy or anything like that, if you got your eye on a $1,000 TV or a $1,200 phone, that's typically not covered by financial aid, and there's no real easy way for that to be done. And I think that's important to recognize as you go forward. Okay, let's move on. I want to show a couple of examples here, and let me take off the zoom so you can see all of this. Basically, this just describes 2 kinds of families. Of course, there's every kind of family. Everybody's financial situation is at least a little bit different. But my situation was more like the ones on the right-hand side here, where I needed more financial aid. There's absolutely no way I could have gone to college without some. There may be students on here, and there certainly will be students at the college you go to, where they may not be able to pay the full price, but they really only need some financial aid. And I'll describe this, and please apologize, my dog is knocking at the door, but I won't stop to let him in. So basically, there's an assumption in calculating your eligibility for financial aid that you have at some point and in some way 2 parents. Most people have not been born from just one parent. Now, there can be circumstances, and I'll get into that on the slide on the right, but here on the left, this is imagining one parent who's actually doing pretty well. They make pretty good money, maybe more than $100,000 a year. That's not enough to pay the full price at Cornell. And so you see that this parent one's income is providing a large part of the budget that it costs to go to Cornell, which might be $55,000 a year. It might even be $75,000 a year. It can depend on which part of Cornell you're attending. But this is a parent that makes pretty good income, so they're paying a little more than half the cost. That's that dark red circle on the right-hand side of that pie chart right here. They've also got some savings. They saved up some value in their house, or they might have some wealth in a business. They might have some savings or even stocks. There is some expectation of being able to spend some of that money. It's not nearly as big a factor as income ever. Even if you make $200,000, you're contributing more from income than you are if your wealth, your savings is more than $1 million. So you're able to save a lot more of your wealth, and parents aren't expected to contribute as much of that to financial aid. And then here, parent two, which is sort of the green and the gray. This is a second parent who's not making that much money, who's working on maybe a minimum wage job or only part-time. And they also don't own as much. They're not contributing much from wealth. That's just a tiny little sliver of gray. But still, both parents in some way are contributing. And then there's the things that you, the student, are contributing directly. So you'll see student income and savings, that's from your work. And you'll see student loan and work while you're in school. So you might borrow some of the money you need as part of going to school, or you might work while you're in classes. And there's good reasons why that can be valuable. And then you see the leftover, the bright red upper left thing, that's your scholarship and your grant. So you got your loan and work, you've got your own pay, you've got the things that both of your parents contributed, but there's a piece left over. In this case, it's maybe about 20% of the total cost that you would get from a scholarship and grant. This is a case where this college or university meets your full financial need. And that's the only kind of case that I've worked for, and that's certainly what's true at Cornell. I think that's worth paying attention to. Is this a college that meets my full need? Because that's really valuable if you can get it. Otherwise, if there was a gap, you'd have to borrow some more to be able to go there. So the scholarship and grant here is about 20% of the total cost. And then look at the circle on the right. Here's a case where even parent one has very little chance to contribute. They don't make very much money. And parent two, you'll see here, is completely gone. And some of us have those situations. The second parent is just completely out of the picture and is not available, or literally makes no money, or not enough even to live on very well for themselves. So maybe that parent doesn't contribute anything. And this can happen in financial aid. Now, what I want you to notice, it's interesting here, see the gold and the yellow. This is the student income and savings. One thing you might notice is for this student, even though the family doesn't make nearly as much money overall, the parents are either not in the picture or they don't have as much money, still the student does contribute for himself or herself. They are contributing some income from their summers, from savings if they have them, or they are contributing through borrowing or working while they're in school. But look at the huge difference here. Here's probably about 85% of what is needed is now coming from financial aid. And you can't see that bottom line, but it's the same thing. Scholarship and grant coming from the university. So the students got their loan and maybe their work, but they've also got this very large scholarship or grant that's paying almost all the costs. And the reason I think it's important to recognize these two functions is when you hear a number like $75,000 a year, you might say, there's no way my family will never be able to pay that. And that could be true in either one of these circumstances. Your family could end up getting a grant that covers 15 or 20,000 of that, but then they're paying the rest. Or your family could end up getting a big scholarship or grant that covers 65, 70,000 of that. And what's really left over that the family has to come up with and the student is very small. So those are almost extremes. There are, of course, situations where students don't qualify for financial aid at all. And then the things in the middle between these two extremes, but this was to illustrate. So this is what a financial aid office needs to figure out what that package I just showed on the slide first, that financial aid package, what it should be for you. The first thing they refer to is how much does it cost? The second thing they refer to is how much can the family afford to pay? And here's how they figure that out. There's a free application that everybody can file every year for financial aid at every university in the United States. It's called the Free Application for Federal Student Aid, or FAFSA. It's online. It's pretty long, but not super long. The questions on it, if you are in a family where you're filing a tax return, a 1040 or a 1040A federal tax return, a lot of the questions on the FAFSA match exactly the same question on the tax return, and they refer to each other. So it's sometimes kind of easy to think about, I'm going to do my tax return, I'm going to also do my FAFSA. And the same information from FAFSA goes to the same college all over the place. This is one of the reasons the FAFSA supports things like a Pell Grant. You may have heard of students having Pell Grants. That's because your Pell Grant that you get is based on your FAFSA information, and your Pell Grant travels with you to whatever college you go to. There's another form, and this is used at places like Cornell and other private universities a lot. It's a more detailed, much more complicated form. It's also online, but they try to charge you a fee up front. If your family can't afford that fee, you can ask the colleges where you want to engage with them. You say, hey, look, I know you want my CSS profile form. I'm going to sit down and work through the complicated details of that, but this fee is crazy. I can't pay this. And you can ask your college to provide you with a fee waiver code so you can get on and do the same form for free. There are different questions than the FAFSA. There's some that are similar. There's more detailed questions, and this is kind of important. Many of the questions you might be asked on the College Scholarship Service, the CSS profile, might not apply to your family. So it's often the case that you look at a question, it doesn't make any sense to you, and you write down 0, and that's okay. A lot of the answers might be 0. It just doesn't apply to you. You don't have that kind of income, and you don't have that kind of expense. And then the important to understand that with this CSS profile information, every college gets the same answers that you've given, but they might use those answers differently. One college might say, we expect a lot of contribution from a family that owns a very expensive house. And another college might say, we're not going to count the house as part of calculating your eligibility. So colleges can really differ, which means you can get different kinds of answers back from colleges. The FAFSA questions and answers might come up with the same exact results. The CSS profile, if you use it for more than one college, can come up with different results. And then, and this gets really complicated and unfortunate, but sometimes colleges ask you to actually submit your tax returns. It's not this year's tax return. It's the tax return that you did more than a year ago, typically during your junior year in high school. So it's a tax return you already have. You don't have to wait for your parents to file your taxes anymore. You can submit last year's copy. But some of the information on the tax return is used to match up with the information on the FAFSA or on the College Scholarship Service form. Sometimes they won't ask for this at the beginning, but they'll ask for it at the end, like in the summer before you actually start at the college. So it's a good idea to be prepared if you're asked to submit a copy of your tax return if you have one. You can also say, we don't file a tax return, and there are families where that's their situation. All of this starts in October 1 of your senior year in high school. So you don't really have to think too much about financial aid forms before you get to October 1 of your senior year. But it is important to get your financial aid applications in, get the documentation done, and submit it at about the same time you apply for admission. So almost everybody sees applications for admission, the Common App, or a form that's specific to that college. It's a good idea if you think you might need financial aid to be applying for financial aid at roughly the same time you apply for admission, so that the information from both of those moves forward quickly. And here's the steps you take. And I've kind of started to mention them, but I want to outline them very specifically. Number one, if you know the colleges you're interested in and you know you might want financial aid to go to that college, read the financial aid website. There are instructions and deadlines and details that differ across every college, and sometimes even for the programs within a college. So read that website for good detail and take notes and ask questions if there's anything that's unclear. Complete the FAFSA, and if it's a college that requires it, complete the CSS profile. Once you start to do that, once you submit the FAFSA and the profile or both to a college, you may start to get a response from them. It may just be an acknowledgement that they've received the information, or they may start to send you questions saying, we see this question doesn't have the right answer, or we don't understand the answer to this one of the questions. You will get emails in most cases asking you to look and to see what's wrong or to see what's missing and to respond as quickly as you can. It's really important that you respond quickly. It can be the case. This is not really that true at Cornell, but it can happen that you've done your forms, but you didn't answer one of the questions correctly, and that slows down your whole process and then might stop you from getting your financial aid information as quickly as you want it. It can even sometimes stop you from getting as much financial aid as you're eligible to get. So being in communication with a financial aid office is really important. This is also important. That's why it's bold and in italics here. You got to get admitted. You're not going to get a financial aid package unless you actually also get admitted to that college. So you really have to do the two things in parallel at the same time. You won't hear from financial aid until either at the same time that you get an admission letter or shortly after. So you'll get your financial aid package, you got admitted. when you get your financial aid package, this is the money that the college is offering you. It'll include sometimes loans, it'll include an expectation of work that you're going to do, and it'll include the scholarships and grants the way I showed on the slide before. Um, you want to review that package, and maybe more than one package. You've got different colleges and you get different packages. You might want to compare them. And then you want to actually talk to your financial aid counselor. You can do it over email. If you're more shy, you can call them up if you really want to make a friend and ask questions from your financial aid counselor. But in most cases, getting your financial aid package, that's not the end of the story. Get the financial aid package, look it over, read it, understand what's a loan, what's work, what are scholarships and grants, and how much am I expected to pay. Get all of that information. And then if anything's at all unclear, call up your financial aid counselor or send an email to your financial aid counselor at the colleges you want to go to, especially the one you want to go to most, and ask them good questions so that they can respond and you get really clear on how much you're expected to pay and what's going to happen next. And then you usually are signing some documents, some agreements. Sometimes if you're taking out a loan, you take out a loan form. And then this is an interesting one, and I only put this in here because people ask this all the time. How do I get a job? Well, campuses that expect you to get a job usually have a job placement office. It's sometimes associated with financial aid. Sometimes it's part of a career center, or it might just be a jobs office on that campus. And if you are expected to work during the school year, you will find job postings from campus employers, sometimes even some off-campus employers, and you can pursue having a job on campus. I think it's important to understand you don't want to get a job until you know you're ready. So if you're working right now while you go to high school, or you've done work in summer and you're sure of that, great. If you're a little nervous about being successful in college, you want to make sure you prioritize your academics, you want to participate in activities, and you're a little unsure about getting a job, you don't have to get a job right away. You could defer that until the second semester of your first year. Some people will even say, you know what, I'm not going to work this year so I can really get settled in. I'll borrow a little bit more so I don't have to work, and then I'll start working my sophomore year. And there are really interesting jobs on college campuses. There's jobs in research labs, there's jobs working with other students, there's jobs in libraries. It's worthwhile to pursue that. And then I'm going to stop with just a few other things to think about. One is you might be eligible for scholarships from the colleges and universities. And even though the things I showed you were about applying for financial aid in general, you also might be able to have a chance to apply for specific scholarships from that college or university. Usually the information about scholarships you can apply to, special ones you can seek out, that you're going to find that on the website. Remember I said, look at the financial aid website early in this process. You might find scholarship applications there or information about scholarships that's worth following up. And then there are other scholarships that will support you going to college that come from outside of the college. Scholarships, including some that are specifically for students from a certain affiliation, or Indigenous students, or Native American students, or American Indian students in general. So it's worthwhile to search around and find scholarships. One thing that's not worthwhile, don't pay anybody to look for scholarships for you. If you find a website that says, pay us $90 and we will find scholarships, that's not a good deal. All the good scholarships, they make their applications available for free. They want you to find them and they want you to apply. So you don't need to pay money to search out for scholarships. And then a few things to ask yourself before you or as you go through this process. Number one is people can end up taking out really big loans in college. That's risky because you might not want a big loan debt to be dragging you down once you get beyond college and you want to get a job. You don't want to spend a lot of your income from that job paying out big loans. So you want to be thoughtful and careful about how much money you borrow. There's also a thing that happens at some of the best colleges and universities in the United States. It happens for some of the students at Cornell, where you don't have to take out any loans. So that's a really good deal. But most colleges and universities are in the middle of that. They're not expecting you to take out really big loans. They're not giving you a package that includes no loans at all. They're asking you to borrow a little bit, a fraction of the total costs. So it's valuable sometimes to think about going to a really good college, even though it's not a no loan college, and borrowing a little bit, because what you're doing is investing in yourself over time. And if you limit your options only to the no loan places, one of the things you're giving yourself a challenge for is you may not get admitted to a place with no loans, and you've got to be ready to go to a really good college that also happens to have some small loans, but be careful about the big loans. Remember that there are, and these things all kind of work together, there can be emergencies. Colleges usually provide and prepare for that. There may be things that are not planned for in your costs, but that become a sudden emergency for you. There was a lot of that this past spring with COVID, and there are usually ways to go and ask colleges for emergency funds when you really need them. And then these two things really go together, managing your money. Some of you may get a lot of money back from the college. Your scholarship pays all your tuition, all your fees, all your housing and board costs, and then there's another $1,000 coming your way at the beginning of the semester. That $1,000 is supposed to last you all the way from September through the end of December. So you have to learn how to do this, if you haven't had to do this before, to budget, to spend your money slowly and keep it over time. So most colleges have things called financial wellness or financial literacy, but you want to make sure you're planning and being careful in budgeting and managing your money, even when it comes as financial aid. And then always being ready to ask for help. If you don't understand something, if you have a question, you don't want to be the person who didn't make yourself ask, and therefore you didn't know and you missed an opportunity or you misunderstood something important. So I'm going to stop there and then bring back my Zoom and ask if there's any questions I didn't get to or anything I ran through too quickly. Anything that's important to you, you can put it in the chat, or I'm happy to take questions verbally, or I'll ask Wava to help me guide any kinds of questions that people might have from any perspective. Oh, here's a great question from Peter. Do outside scholarships affect financial aid that I would have received? This is one of those things that, this is why it's valuable to read a college website. Every college and university can do this differently. So it's always good to get outside scholarships. Never think that there's a reason not to pursue that. Number one, of course, you can get the scholarship money. Number two, even if you don't get to use all of the money for a kind of reasons, and I'll sort of answer your question about that in a second. You get the connection to whoever gives the scholarship. You get somebody to send a thank you note to. You get somebody who's invested and cares about what you're doing, who may have jobs beyond, they may have summer activities. So you're building a relationship and a network by getting a scholarship even beyond the actual money that you get. Some scholarships that you can ask for are pretty small in light of, I mean, if a college costs $50,000, it might seem like, well, why would I bother trying to get a $500 scholarship? But number one, every bit helps. And the people who sponsor that scholarships might be really helpful people in your life. So you want to pursue outside scholarships. However, some colleges may say every dollar you bring in an outside scholarship is money they take away from your financial aid package. They use all that money as it was intended to pay for college costs. Other colleges might say you can keep some of that money, but you can't keep all of it because we've already planned for you to get as much money as you need. So we're going to give you some of that extra, but not all of it every time. And then some colleges will give it all to you, but that's not necessarily a great thing, because if they're giving you all that outside money, it's often because they didn't actually give you a full financial aid package in the first place. So remember, I used the word gap. Sometimes a financial aid office will give you a package that has a gap in it. You can get an outside scholarship that helps you fill that gap, but the problem was you had that gap in the first place, which is a really uncomfortable thing to have. So look at the policies of the college before you start, but no matter what, pursue as many scholarships as you think you can do, that you can fill out applications for, and that you're competitive to get. I hope that answered your question, Peter. Great question too from Marina. I'm an emancipated minor. How will that affect my financial aid? Outstanding. You guys are clearly on top of this. I was going too basic for you. Yeah, that's actually an outstanding question. If you are emancipated, or for any other reason you are determined to be an independent student, let me back up. Most students coming from high school, or even young students that are at part of the early part of college as a transfer student, are assumed to be dependent on their parents. So all the things I showed you were based on having a family with one or two parents, and that family is responsible for paying some of the costs. But if you are a legally emancipated minor, a ward of the court or a ward of the state, or if you are independent for some other reason, the young students who've been in the armed services or have been married or are married will often be considered independent. The rules can change from one college to another. Sometimes just being a certain age can make you an independent student. It's all the same, except they're only they're only monitoring and evaluating what you yourself have made as income and what wealth you own for yourself. So there's no parent calculations involved. It's just you. But one of the things you have to be careful about that is if it's just you and you're not coming straight from high school, they're going to ask you as an independent student, well, okay, you spent the past year not in high school and as an independent student, they might ask you for some details. How did you live? How did you support yourself? And if you were making an income that supported you, they may make an assumption that you can continue to make a pretty good income even after you start in college. It can be kind of tricky to say, well, yeah, I was working a job uh, anywhere. I'm working a fast food job and I was making $15 an hour. And so I show some money that I made, but now that I'm going to college, I'm not going to work that job anymore, obviously. So you can't actually expect me to pay that. But they may say, well, look, you made $30,000 last year. You worked full time and you made some money. You have to bring some of that money with you to pay your college costs. So it's, if you're already an emancipated minor or in some other way independent, then you'll get a package based on being an independent student. But be careful if somebody gives you advice and says, you know, you ought to try to be an independent student, because sometimes that can give you more money. Sometimes it can actually give you less money. One of the things you might have noticed in my example on the right of the family where not much money is made, if you've got parents that don't make a lot of money themselves, or they make a bit of money, but they've also got a lot of other children in their family, or some other reason their expenses are very high, it can be the case that the parent contribution is less than the student contribution. And that's even more dramatically true when the student is considering themselves independent. So don't rush to be an independent or student. Emancipated minor is a legal status, so I assume that's already true. But if you are thinking, should I become an independent student, it's not always worth it. And it's especially not worth it if that delays your education by a year. Delaying your education to make money never makes sense, because think about it, the job you have coming out of high school is not as good as the job you're going to have coming out of college. So now you're taking that 5-year period, college plus job, you're making less money in that first year, then you're doing your 4 years of college. Whereas if you went straight to college, however you can get there, and did 4 years and borrowed and worked and obviously worked hard and succeeded in college, then that 5th year you get a job that pays you as a college graduate. That's typically a lot more than you could make straight coming out of high school. So it almost never makes sense to delay your education just for the sake of making money. Those are two great questions. I'm happy to take more. I know we're moving along through our hour and we need to give you a break and also get you set up to talk to the faculty. But I think I might have up to 8 more minutes here if there are other questions or things that I need to explain better than I did going back to the presentation. Maybe Wava or Ursula, you help me out with any questions that you thought of that I didn't cover that you've seen covered in the past or that you know students have on their mind?
I would just say too that there is a lot of scholarships for Native students out there, and
Absolutely.
that sometimes your nation also has money that you can apply to. So I would encourage you all to apply to those other sources, um, because you know a lot of times they can be applied to your bill and they can help pay for expenses. Um, yeah, so there are quite a few of them out there. So I would encourage you to apply for them and look for them early. You could even start looking for them now because a lot of them have early admissions deadlines. They kind of go throughout the whole year actually, of various deadlines for those different types of scholarships. And if I had any type of tip for those kind is that I think looking local can sometimes be a little more successful than going for all of the like big national ones, but definitely go for those too. But yeah, so there are.
I'll tell you a secret from my personal life. When I was in senior in high school and I knew my parents didn't have any money to give me for college and I knew I was going to have to come up with a lot of money from somewhere, I applied for and got 5 different outside scholarships. So don't hesitate, go for it. It can take a lot of time. The applications can get kind of busy and tricky, so you might have to calibrate that. But many of you probably should be looking far and wide. And as Weva says, local is great because they really like to support and sponsor. Several of my scholarships were for local people in San Diego, California, where I grew up. So yeah, I highly recommend that. That was huge.
So if you do end up having to take out a loan, um, what can you describe the kind of the options there are like after you graduate, or maybe also the options for taking them out, and then kind of the options for like after you graduate of how you can pay them off?
So with loans, there's a maximum amount of borrowing you're allowed to do through two federal government programs. This is the bulk of all the loans that go on in college in the United States are through two federal programs. Um, one of them probably won't apply to you directly. It's a parent loan for undergraduate students. Your parents may choose to take that. That is not a need-based loan. I don't necessarily encourage that because the parents often don't need to be borrowing either. They should just be spending as they go from their income, but it's available. The other one is available to almost every student that files a FAFSA is eligible for one of these loans, and it's called the direct loans, the federal direct loans. They go up to a maximum of $5,500 in your first year and your second year, and $7,500 in your third and fourth year. They let you borrow a little more the closer you get to graduating. So if you add that up, 2 years at 5,500, 2 years at 7,500, that means through that program, you can borrow a maximum of $26,000. And that's about right. That's not too much to borrow for a 4-year education. That's less than what you'd borrow typically to buy a nice car, or at least a new car. And that's a really good investment because your education is going to pay off a lot more than a car over the course of your lifetime. So that's why I say when a place has small loans that are just those federal loans, that's a pretty good deal. And you shouldn't hesitate to go to a college that asks you to borrow that much. A college could ask you to borrow more. They could ask your parents to borrow as part of paying the costs. That's where you want to get a little more careful, and it's a little more tricky because you don't really want to borrow so much that when you graduate, like I said, all of your income is going to pay off your loans, or you have to structure them a certain way to be able to pay them all back. What can often happen too is you're not asked to borrow the maximum amount available in your first year and beyond. So Cornell would be an example of that. We have students who, in theory, would be eligible for the full $5,500 loan in their first year, but we only ask them to borrow $1,500. So we leave $4,000 out. We're not asking you or expecting you to borrow that. That's good. That means you're borrowing less right from the very beginning, and you might end up graduating with a lot less debt, which is not a bad thing. However, and this is important to understand, you now have this extra eligibility for loans. So there may be circumstances and reasons where it makes sense for you to borrow some more, but you want to be really careful about that. You want to talk with your financial aid counselor, make sure this is a case where it's worthwhile to borrow some more of what you're eligible for. In Cornell's case, one example is students, sometimes they're on their parents' health insurance, and sometimes their parents' health insurance doesn't cover them. So they might need to borrow a little bit in order to have good Cornell health insurance. Things like that can come up, and they can come up in any college. Different colleges prioritize different kinds of things for which students might borrow. You may go study abroad. It's a great thing to do. So you go to a college for 4 years, but for a semester or even a whole year, you go study in a completely different country. You may want, while you're studying in a different country, your financial aid will typically follow you, but you may decide, okay, I'm going to be in Spain for a year. I want to take a month and go travel around Europe. That just sounds fantastic, but I need to borrow a little bit for that. If you're at a place where you didn't have to borrow everything for your education, you might be willing and interested in taking out a bit of a loan for that once in a lifetime experience. So there are conditions that move back and forth with loans. But you just want to be careful. Every time you take out a loan, you also do an online webinar and some counseling that shows that you know what you're doing, that you're borrowing, you know how much you're going to have to pay back after you graduate. So you really want to pay attention to that and make sure you're being very thoughtful about how much you decide to borrow.
I also wanted to draw everyone else's attention to, oh, Cornell has a financial aid calculator, and I will put the link to that in the chat. So it's more accurate, the more accurate information you can give it. So if the information, from about your parents' income and things like that, if it's accurate, the calculator will be more accurate and it'll give you an estimate of how much aid you would receive from Cornell, a grant and loans, and how much your contribution and your parent contribution would be.
Yeah, thank you very much. I should have put that in the presentation. Thank you, Eva. Uh, I just want to mention, Weva said it a couple times, but it's an estimate. It's not 100% accurate, but it's a really good way to start down the path. And if any of you are like me, where the money is just really scary and risky, doing this can often be very reassuring because you might see a really big number that Cornell is prepared to offer in financial aid, which is a good thing.
And then maybe one last thing before we take a break. Could you describe work study a little bit?
Sure. Well, remember, I in my one slide I said get a job. And I want to mention there's two ways to do this. At Cornell and most places, typically the job is paid in part through work study. Work study is another federal government program. So when you file the FAFSA, you are potentially establishing your eligibility to get a work study fund. What work study means from a Cornell's perspective is financial aid pays half of your wage, and then your employer, whoever hires you, pays the other half. And there's other kinds of ratios, but basically 50-50 is a pretty common. So it's shared. So we're giving the employer an incentive to hire you. You've got a work study award, but you're actually getting money from both sources. It is possible, and this is important, you may not get a work study award. You may not qualify, or they may run out of work study, but you could still potentially look for and get a job on campus or off campus. So working is sometimes paid through the work study program, but it's also sometimes not. There's jobs that can be available to you that do not require you to have a work study award. So, and maybe even the job that you want the most. You're working closely with a research professor in the summertime, or working in her lab on Fridays and Saturdays after your school week is done. That may not be a work study job, but it could be a great job to have. So you want to keep looking back and forth and making sure you're matching up with the best job you can get. Maybe that involves work study, and sometimes it doesn't.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions?
I know that was a lot of information. I'm happy to answer more questions if they come up later in the evening. Weva and others know how to find me, or I just tell you, you can see my name, Burdick, Burdick. That's my email, burdick@cornell.edu. Very happy to keep acquainted and help you beyond this if the opportunity arises.
Yeah, thank you so much for presenting here today, sharing all that information. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Nice to meet all of you.